Welcome. Thank you for coming this afternoon to hear Professor Glaser, Charles Glaser, who's visiting the Department of Government this term as the Roth family distinguished visitor here at Dartmouth College. We're delighted to have you, Charlie. And today, as you can see, Professor Glaser is going to be speaking on security challenges posed by the rise of China. You might have noticed in your morning perusal of the New York Times that China, it was reported this morning in the New York Times that China has taken out a 75-year renewable lease on Tulagi, the island of Tulagi, which has 1,000 people living on it. It's one of the Solomon Islands, and apparently it was considered a gem, a military gem in World War II because of its natural deep water harbor. And it had, up until about a month ago, the Solomon Islands were allied, in the sort of American, under the American umbrella, you could say, and they were connected. They recognized Taiwan. They arrested their relations with Taiwan as of about September 15th, and recognized Beijing. So something's changing, and the New York Times this morning reports that American officials are alarmed. At least some American officials are alarmed by this, and they think that these Solomon Islands are crucial to keep China in check. So is it in America's national security interest to kind of defend the status quo in Asia, and or should we accommodate China's geopolitical interests as it rises? This is the central question for American decision makers, for citizens who are trying to understand how the United States should defend its interests and advance its interests and protect its interests in the face of the rise of China. And so to help us understand that, I think there's really nobody better who we could listen to today than Professor Glaser. It's one of the reasons I'm really delighted you're here today to talk to us, Charlie, and also why you're here all year to hang out, meet students, connect with faculty. Professor Glaser is a professor at George Washington University, where he's a professor of political science and also has been the founding director of the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies. He's the author of The Rational Theory of International Politics and the Logic of Competition and Cooperation. As I understand these things, and I took exactly one semester of international relations, I've been doing a lot of damage with that one semester ever since. Professor Glaser is a realist. And he explains certain features, well, maybe most features of the international world with reference to what countries do to protect and advance their own interests, as opposed to those who are inclined to explain the world in terms of maybe moral norms that arise as part of the liberal international order. And I don't really want to pigeonhole you because, like I say, I have exactly one semester of background in this, and the very contrast might be a little bit too clumsy. But I do think there's very few things that are more vital to understand, not for just specialists and not just for decision makers, but for citizens. And so for that purpose, really, I'm just delighted to welcome you, Charlie, to welcome you to Dartmouth, to the Department of Government, and to this lecture hall this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Dartmouth for having me here this year. It's great being on sabbatical in general. It's even better being here at Dartmouth, which is known for its great international relations group. And it's really special to be the Roth visiting scholar. So with all that, thank you. I'm going to talk today about a book that I'm going to be working on this year that I've worked on pieces of already and many new pieces to be accomplished while I'm here. So I'm going to start with an overview. Today I decided to trade breadth for depth, so I'm going to give you an idea of what I think the key questions are, how I would go about thinking about them, and not give as many answers. Usually you give a talk and you start from the beginning, you're sort of working toward a conclusion that you want to defend. I'm not going to make many conclusions or defend many. And in fact, many of the questions I'm going to study in this project I think are quite hard. I can argue either side pretty well. Maybe we'll get into some of that in the question and answers. So here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to give some background. We have quite a range of of individuals here today, so some of you probably know a lot about China. Some of you may not know so much, so I'll give some basic background. Then I'm going to frame the project itself. I'm going to identify 6 questions that I think are essential for the United States to answer, starting at a very high level and then working down to rather specific questions. I'm going to talk about the role of international relations theory and of uncertainty in answering these questions and explain, not only for the sake of students and for the faculty that are here to reassure ourselves that international relations theory is valuable, but in fact actually to show why you really need to use it to analyze some of the questions I'm going to put on the table today. And then I'm going to sketch the analysis of a couple of the key questions that I put on the table. So I want to talk about grand strategy, which is where we should be in the world and why, and whether we should stay involved in East Asia. I'm going to talk about whether we should maintain our commitment to Taiwan. And then if time allows, I may talk about U.S. nuclear strategy, but I have a feeling I won't get there, but I made slides for it just in case. So let me start by saying we're at a turning point in U.S. policy toward China. So if you read this quote, this is from an official 2018 U.S. document, the National Defense Strategy. And it says that security, U.S. prosperity and security is the reemergence of a long-term strategic competition by revisionist powers. That's the central challenge we face. So from 1990, basically until 10 years ago, we didn't worry much about major power competition. The Cold War ended. The United States was the dominant power. We worried about terrorism, first Civil War, then terrorism. China's rise, and to some extent, changes in Russian policy, although Russia's declining, have redefined the U.S. security agenda. I think this is a very succinct statement of how the U.S. official government now sees that China will continue to pursue military modernization programs that seek Indo-Pacific regional hegemony in the near term and displacement of the United States to achieve global preeminence in the future. Regional hegemony would mean essentially pushing the United States out one way or another out of East Asia. And so this is a very strong position. It's relatively new. It was not the position of the Obama administration, although I think that much of the U.S. experience during the Obama administration was leading in this direction. And now many people who are officials in the Obama administration have come to take this view. But it's important for us to realize that it's not a full consensus. And a number of scholars think that the pendulum has swung too far. We needed to update our view of China, but it's gone too far. So in a recent article, a recent letter, open letter that was published in the Washington Post, 100 experts on China, both on China and U.S. foreign policy, signed a letter that made the following key points. I'm not going to read all of it, but it says, among other things, that they believe U.S. actions are contributing to a downward spiral. So it's not only that China is an increasingly difficult country, but we're contributing to that. That the current U.S. approach under the Trump administration is fundamentally counterproductive. That they believe Beijing is not an economic enemy or an existential national threat to U.S. security, which is a very different flavor, maybe not in direct contradiction to the defense strategy statement, but close to it. And then putting out here, just to put things in perspective, that even though China is growing tremendously in capability, that it's decades off before it becomes a real global military power, and the only current global military power being the United States. So one thing going into this discussion or analysis of China is to realize that people who know China extremely well don't agree about the nature of the country that's posing the challenge. I should also say I'm not a China expert in the sense of having studied the country over decades, and I don't speak the language. I bring a sort of lens, hopefully, of a very good policy analyst and a good theorist, and can learn enough about China from people that really are experts to tackle these questions. But there are many people that have spent their lives and careers studying China from in a very nuanced way. So a little background to start with. Even though there's a lot of disagreement, I would say on many points, and just for starting our discussion, the number of key points that we can put on the table that in broad terms there's agreement on, even there I'll explain some disagreement. So first, there's been extraordinary economic and technological development in China over the last 3 or 4 decades. So if you look at these charts, the one I get to, which is on your left, is GDP comparison. And you can see how China went from very little to now still far behind the United States, but tremendous growth relative to the United States. The chart on your right actually looks at purchasing power parity. So if you actually think of what you can buy with China, turns out GDP is a very complicated concept, but if you look at what you can buy with it, China actually now exceeds the US in GDP and crossed sort of in a few years ago. Now, it's not clear what any of these tell us exactly, except that China is now either the largest economy or the second largest economy globally, having gone from a very small economy 4 decades ago. A very different comparison here on the left is of per capita GDP. So if the United States and China are roughly the same size economies, but the United States is 1/4 the number of people, then the United States is much wealthier per person. And this, of course, matters if you're thinking about what you can do militarily or internationally. You have to think about how much can you extract from your population and dedicate to foreign policy or military policy. So just looking at GDP is not a good measure. Just looking at per capita wealth is also not a good measure, because what if you had an incredibly small country? You could have very rich individuals, but you wouldn't be able to raise the resources for a large military. So then some people propose this other measure, which is GDP times GDP per capita. And that gives you a kind of combination of the two and tells you maybe how much a country, all else equal, can extract. None of these are great measures. The main thing I would take from it is China's grown tremendously. It's actually historically without precedent. And depending upon how China moves forward, they have tremendous potential to compete with the United States. If we go further, though, one thing we can probably agree on, but once again is contentious depending on how you look at it, is this very large conventional buildup by China, which is now making it much harder for the United States to perform what I could call key military missions in Northeast Asia. And in particular, the one that I focused on and worry about the most is it is much harder now for the United States to defend Taiwan than it was a decade ago, and much more than it was 3 decades ago. In addition, China is going through a major modernization of its nuclear forces. And so where the United States used to have a very large advantage in nuclear capability, that advantage is closing. And I can describe some of that in detail if we have time. But even this doesn't, so those are good places to start, but people in the audience, and some have disagreed with this characterization, actually. So I put up a couple charts. China has engaged in a very large buildup, but if you look at spending over time, and actually current spending, the United States still spends much more than China. The United States is the blue bar at the bottom, and China is the red bar near the top. So we're currently spending about twice as much as China per year on defense. But of course, how much you have in your military depends upon, is an accumulation also. So we've accumulated assets over decades. And if you think about China accumulating assets over that red swath, then the United States is a much larger military. And then the chart on the right, which might be incomprehensible, but actually is very insightful, comes from an article by 2 people here at Dartmouth, so I felt compelled to put it up. Shows the percentage of advanced military capabilities the United States has. So the United States is sort of the gray area that reaches out. And if you look, this is all about aircraft carriers, submarines, advanced aircraft, and helicopters. It shows the United States has sort of 70 or 80% of all the advanced systems in the world. This is in probably 13, 14. And China is that little red dot, little black dot right in the middle, has sort of none. That's changing over time, but the point here is that just even looking at defense spending doesn't tell you much, because you have to think about what system states have and how good they are at using them. Having said that, you might also get the wrong impression by looking at this, because you might think that China was not militarily capable. But in the end, what really matters are the ability to perform specific missions that matter to the United States. So what do we need to do with our forces relative to China's? And for a variety of reasons, I would argue, and I think most people would agree, the missions we have to perform against China in many ways favor China. They're close to China's maritime periphery. We're talking about defending Taiwan against Chinese attack. We come basically from continental United States or Japan or Guam. China is much closer. So it turns out that even though China doesn't have the military that's yet comparable to the United States, it's making it much harder for the United States to perform certain missions that are very important to our defense. And so in that, it's like you've got a broad overview, you can look at spending, but in the end, you've got to look at actually what you really need to accomplish. And we'll get to some of that when we talk about Taiwan. Oops, sorry. Okay, so in addition to these points, I think we can agree that, because there's not much, there's sort of a broad picture on the other ones, but that China's policy in the South China Sea has been quite assertive and is one of the main things that has soured U.S.-China relations. They've built islands basically by taking sand from the ocean and put military facilities on those islands. And even though the islands are small, and at first you could dismiss them for being small, it turns out they're large enough to house substantial military bases. And China's also rejected key international judgments about claims that it's made to both maritime terrain and to these island features. And so in that sense, it's been both assertive and worrisome, but partly because it's rejecting international understandings. And finally, a topic that I won't have much to say today about, but certainly has played a very important role in U.S.-China relations, are unfair Chinese trade practices. And even though it's fallen to the Trump administration in a sense to start, or actually in many ways actually continue a more competitive or assertive trade policy with China, I think this was coming. It actually started under the Obama administration, and it's sort of expected if you understood the terrain. So that's all sort of its background. If I had to say in broad terms, what we have is we have a much more capable China than we've had for decades. We have a China that's worrying commentators because it is assertive in its region, because it hasn't followed international norms in a variety of areas. It's militarily much more capable than it was, although not nearly as capable yet as the United States, but it can perform very important missions in its region. So with that as sort of background, which I've gone through sort of quickly, but to give you a feel for how I understand the question, and for those of you who don't follow it, I think that is a fair sort of thin description. Let me put on the table the 6 questions that I think are the key questions, and that I'll actually be looking at in my book project. They'll have a theoretical front end, and I'll take on these policy questions. First is the grand strategy question. By grand strategy, I mean simply, where in the world should the United States be committed to defending allies and have other types of security commitments? And specifically, should we stay in East Asia? One possible move for the United States would be to say China is rising, and you could argue that makes it more or less likely, more or less important to be in East Asia, and I'll actually go through that debate. This is not so much on the policy agenda. We're sort of taking, actually, as Russ said, in some ways, we're taking some of the status quo as given. We're in East Asia, and we're going to stay. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I think that's the first order question, and particularly with a rising power, this is a question we should be thinking about. Second, assuming we stay, should we maintain our commitment to Taiwan? And I've written about this at some length, and my own views are a bit controversial, but I think it's very important if we stay to reconsider this commitment, and I'll explain why. Third, what should we do in the South China Sea, which is potentially the most difficult, although I don't think the most important of all these questions. And here the issues have to do with how should we confront China as it continues to build in the South China Sea, to militarize the South China Sea, to maybe draw into question freedom of navigation, and a variety of other issues. And then, in a sense, 3 more specific issues. You can think of the first 3 as being what our commitment should be in broad terms, and then 3 military questions. What nuclear strategy should we have to implement this strategy? And specifically, I'm interested in the question of how intensely the United States should compete with China to try and undermine its ability to acquire what I would consider to be an adequate nuclear retaliatory capability. Since I may not get to this, I'll just talk about it briefly. Until recently, China has had a small and vulnerable nuclear force, which we could destroy, maybe not with full confidence, but we could have the expectation of destroying most, if not all of it, at least by the mid-1990s. Now China is making that force much harder to destroy, and that has implications for how well we can defend our interests. What kind of conventional strategy should we have to protect our interests? And I should say, I haven't mentioned these yet, but we have alliance interests in Japan, in South Korea, in the Philippines, in Australia, important complicated partnership of types with Taiwan. How do we want to defend those interests conventionally? And there's a spectrum, which I'm not going to get into today, but some are potentially highly efficient and effective, but also potentially dangerous. They involve early and large attacks against the Chinese homeland. Or you can think of a different set of strategies, which in some ways maybe are not quite as effective, that work more slowly, but are potentially also less escalatory. And so we face an important trade-off there. And of course, this will be related to our alliance relations. If we can't confidently defend our allies conventionally, they're going to be really worried about relying on us and may have to pursue other means to achieve their own goals. And then finally on trade, and this is now, I'm thinking about this as a security question, not as a prosperity question for the United States, but as we pursue trade, if at all, with China, should we continue to benefit from comparative advantage in the trade as we have for the last few decades, or should we start to pull back and separate our economy from the Chinese economy, because in a variety of ways it can pose threats to U.S. security, partly by enabling China to grow effectively compared to the United States, partly by enabling China to have advanced technologies that it might not otherwise be able to develop on its own, partly because of interactions between Chinese students and scholars that give them the kind of expertise that they don't develop on their own, but they can develop by participating in education in the United States and the West. So once you're involved in an intense security competition, things that appear to be mutually beneficial or benign are potentially threatening. And how do you balance that out when there are prosperity benefits to this kind of engagement? There may also be socialization benefits that people that come, if you have hundreds of thousands of students coming to China a year, it may actually be valuable in the long term for the evolution of Chinese policy. So these are the 6 questions. I mean, of course, there are many specific issues and questions within the questions, and there are lots of other issues. But my thinking is that this really captures the broad sweep of what U.S. policy has to deal with. And in some ways, the framing, although it's sort of straightforward, is very important because it determines what we go and we look at and what we leave behind and don't consider. So this is my agenda. And so I'm going to cover these topics. Now, before I start to talk about them, I want to, so here's, I was told this thing has a pointer, which is quite amazing. Okay, so for those of you that don't know the area, this obviously is China. This stretch of ocean from Taiwan south is the South China Sea. This is what's called the Strait of Malacca through here. So if you're coming from the Persian Gulf, you go through the Strait of Malacca up through the South China Sea to China. This is the East China Sea, which has an important conflict in here between Japan and China. Our allies in Japan, South Korea, partner not quite ally with Taiwan, ally in the Philippines, Australia. And then growing military relations in particular with other states, but maybe Vietnam most importantly. Okay, so that's just the geography, which maybe will help with some of the discussion. I want to take 2 sort of digressions before I jump into talking about the particular questions. And I want to talk about some of the role about international relations theory. It's often said that, or considered that policy analysis is somehow atheoretical, and there's sort of theory and there's policy, and you sort of do one or the other. People that do theory, particularly in political science, sometimes look down upon people that do policy analysis, thinking it's sort of very concrete and doable, but I think they're both really hard. Very importantly, they're both complementary. And the point I want to make today is that particularly when it's a big change, a big shock to the system, like China's rise, the theory questions turn out to be essential to really, or theory itself turns out to be essential to doing the analysis. And let me try to give you some sense of why. First of all, theorists disagree about whether China's rise is going to create and necessarily will create a very intense relationship between the United States and China, competitive relationship. If it's going to be competitive and is more or less beyond the control of US policy, then there are certain policies we should pursue as a result. If, on the other hand, it's possible that certain types of cooperation that, while protecting US interests, have the potential to moderate China, then we might want to consider pursuing those policies, even if they're somewhat risky. On net, they might be best. And so to resolve this, you need to know some of the most basic sort of what we call grand theory or basic theory questions. Most important, most fundamental, maybe not most important, but does the international system just drive states into competition? So for those of you that have studied some of this so-called realism or other things, you'll know there's a debate among realists about whether the international system, just because states want to be secure, not because they want anything else, but because they want to be secure, major powers are going to get in intense competitive relations with each other, and there's a danger and the likelihood of war that follows. Whether or not that's true really will influence the kind of choices we would make with respect to China, although in fact they can cut in more ways in multiple directions. A sub-argument, which is related but different, is do rising powers want to dominate and need to dominate their regions? So when you say they want to be a regional hegemon, it means it's the only major power that exerts influence in that region. Right now, the United States is in, you could put it this way provocatively, the United States is in China's region. We need to sort of remember that. We've got forces deployed along their maritime periphery. They don't have anything, they don't have forces. So we're in their region. We've got, as I said, we've got allies and forward deployed forces in South Korea, and in Japan, most importantly, we have forces in Guam, which are an attacking distance of China. Is China going to want to push us out of that region? Not necessarily by fighting, but by making it so hard and costly for us to stay that we'll eventually leave. If so, we're going to have a very intense regional competition because the United States is unlikely to want to leave, although maybe we should. That's a separate question. Other people don't think that's true. They think that a rising power doesn't need to be a regional hegemon to be secure. You can be secure in your region without the United States need not be a security threat, even if it stays in Japan, deployed in Japan. You get very different policies. What about power transitions, which are all part of the same theory, but you've commonly heard maybe of that power transitions lead to war. We're in the process of a slow but clear transition from US global dominance, loosely speaking, since the end of the Soviet Union, until now, where China in one way or another is passing the United States or equalizing the United States, or at least in its region is offsetting major US advantages. If that's likely to lead to war, that has major implications. If it's not likely, it gives us a different kind of leeway. So you need to know the answers, if not the answers, you need to know that there's debate on this. There's not a single answer, and maybe to some extent deal with that complexity. And I've sort of said why the answers matter. Cooperative policies will fail if it's unavoidably a competitive system, in which case they will make the United States less secure. So you sort of have to decide, even within this realist debate, is it going to be unavoidably competitive or not? If it's not, then there are a variety of risks that the United States might want to run that will increase its security. And also, if China's going to compete very hard, it's going to make our task harder. It's going to be harder to deter China. It's going to be harder to have adequate capabilities. It's going to be riskier, and that could also influence the U.S. decision about whether to stay. But also, if we stay, it could influence how much we need to invest and the kind of alliances we need to build. Okay, so that's on theory. I don't want to give you the impression, though, that it's only realist theory. So there are lots of other theories, and I'm just going to run through them, or not even run through them, I'm just going to name them. So it's sort of like a labeling thing. If you know what these are, it's helpful. If not, you can just wait till the slide is over. But there's a big debate about whether regime type matters. Would China be way less dangerous if it were democracy? Or is it much more dangerous because it is an authoritarian regime? Or maybe it doesn't matter? Some theories say it doesn't matter, others say it matters a lot, and we should be much more worried because the type of regime that we face. Economic interdependence. Right now, we're deeply intertwined economically with China. Some people think that makes conflict less likely because trade is valuable and states don't want to give it up. And other people think it makes war and competition more likely because it creates vulnerabilities that each side can try to take advantage of. And once states are vulnerable, insecure, they tend to act forcefully often. So can the United States make concessions without undermining the credibility for protecting its allies? So, for example, I've argued, and we'll touch on today, that the United States should consider breaking its commitment to Taiwan. One of the key counterarguments is that if the United States does that, it will undermine Japanese confidence in the United States as an ally and will damage or maybe destroy the alliance. It's partly just a factual question. We can go learn enough about Japan. But on the other hand, anyway, without going the whole thing, Japan will say a lot of things about how it will wreck the alliance, but in the end, I think it won't wreck the alliance, partly because I don't think our credibility is that tightly connected between Taiwan and Japan. They're different. Also, Japan doesn't have anywhere else to go. But that's all into the specifics of the debate. But anyway, this is partly a factual question, but it's partly a theory question. Can we do this? Can we make concessions without undermining our alliances? On the flip side, there's the question about whether as China becomes more and more powerful, our allies are going to defect. So there's an argument that states tend to balance against power and threats. But some people think that if a state becomes powerful enough, it will draw countries to it, which is called bandwagoning. So balancing is sort of joining the weaker side or the less threatening side. Bandwagoning is joining with the stronger side, and there's a concern that if China becomes powerful enough, our allies will essentially defect. And instead of working with the United States, Japan will actually become part of a partnership of some sort with China, create a bloc that excludes the United States. So how much we need to worry about that is a theory question, as much as a factual question. We can do some things to influence it, but it will influence our policy. And then just back to the nuts and bolts of military policy, how difficult is conventional deterrence and how difficult is nuclear deterrence? And these are complicated questions that have long histories and well-developed arguments from the Cold War. But to some extent, whether you should stay and defend allies depends upon how effective you can be and how hard it is to be effective. And so this question, for instance, is tied to the grand strategy question. If it turned out you couldn't protect your allies, it was just too hard, then it would make sense to leave. If it was relatively easy or relatively low risk, you should stay. Well, how do you know those things? Partly it depends on the nature of the adversary. Probably it depends on the international system and how hard it drives states into competition, but partly it just depends on the logic of the costs and benefits of being attacked and being able to deter. So these are all sort of other questions, and there's a full laundry list in addition that make these policy questions theory questions. I also want to talk about another issue that I think is important to acknowledge in thinking about China, which is just the sheer uncertainty we face in dealing with these questions. And the thing I would say is I'm going to go through some of the key uncertainties, but I think the key point from a policy perspective is that when you face uncertainty, there's a strong inclination to decide which of those possibilities you think is right and then plan against that possibility. And that's not what you want to do. What you want to do is accept the full range of uncertainty and plan against the range. Not necessarily equally across the whole range, but you would want what we would call a robust policy that works relatively well across the range of possibilities. And so it's important to accept uncertainty for what it is, including that the China experts can't agree on the nature of China, in which case it's not really smart for me to decide because they know way more about it and they can't decide. So I want to design policy that works relatively well across the expert distribution of types of China that we may face. And many examples like that. So the first one is about this. Will China continue to grow? Some people think that China may collapse for a variety of domestic and regime type reasons. If that's true, you might say, well, first of all, you don't know. But if you believed it was a possibility, you might be less willing to make concessions now. Because China might not be a threat in the future and you wouldn't have to make those concessions. So to some extent, or in many different ways, but your future bet on where China is headed influences policy. Another thing that's critical, and it's probably often the most important issue in any major power evaluation, is what does the adversary really want? What are their goals? So we often think about states as being certain types. So is China a state that really is driven only by security? It's an insecure state. And you might think, how could China be an insecure state? It's just sitting there with this huge landmass. I'm not going to go into it at length, but if you think the United States is ever at all insecure, divided by two huge oceans, and no real threats, think about China. China's like got states all around its landmass. It's got the world's major power in its neighborhood. We can interrupt all the sea lanes, both from the Persian Gulf to the Strait of Malacca through the South China Sea. And that all puts aside the question of Taiwan, which we think legitimately is an independent country, but China as strongly, and in its view, as legitimately thinks it's part of China. And the extent that it's not part of China is a major source of Chinese insecurity. So China is, at a minimum, an insecure state. Is it also a state that wants to expand for other reasons, for status, for economic purposes? Does it want to take territory to aggrandize itself as well? People disagree, and we don't know. So we have to plan against that possibility. Are its aims limited or unlimited? It's clear that China has expansionist aims from our perspective in the sense that it wants to control Taiwan. It may not want much more than Taiwan. If it wants a lot more, that matters a lot to our policy, and if it will be satisfied with Taiwan, that matters a lot to our policy, which isn't to say we should break our connections to Taiwan, but it makes it a very different proposition for reasons that I'll go into. These are things we don't know for sure. Doesn't mean we don't know anything, but we don't know for sure. There are also a number of military technical questions that we don't know the answers to. For instance, we don't know how hard it is going to be for China to keep the United States away from its maritime periphery, or how hard it is going to be for the United States to be able to prevent the freedom of action in the South China Sea in a large conflict. Experts disagree, and it's partly the result of changing technology that has to do with reconnaissance, it has to do with precision. But so there are uncertainties about the conventional balance, the ability to perform conventional missions in ongoing competition between the United States and China. There's also uncertainties about nuclear weapons and the nuclear balance. And I'm just going to leave that there because I have time constraints. But and I'd say there's a long-term question for the United States, which is, are we prepared for this competition? We competed in, I think, a relatively smart and relatively effective way with the Soviet Union for a number of decades. Many people think U.S. policy is not as smart and coherent as it was in those decades, and it raises the question, if it turns out that China not only doesn't collapse, but turns out to be an economically effective authoritarian regime, is the United States prepared to compete over the next few decades with that China? Is it prepared to make the investments that it will take to be a first-rate competitor against a first-rate, technologically advanced economy? And I think people don't know for sure, but when you look at this question and say, what should our policies be, we need to take into account whether or not we're committed and able to do that over time, as well as all the other uncertainties that sort of lie outside of our domestic grasp. Okay, so that's all by way of background and perspective. I'm going to take about 15 or 20 minutes just to talk about a couple of the key policy questions, and that will leave us about half an hour for Q&A. Okay, so this is the most basic question. People here have written about it at length. We have real experts at Dartmouth. They don't necessarily agree with each other, so that makes it interesting. But the question here is, should we stay in East Asia? And I'm just going to give a little bit of background on these debates, and then I'm going to explain how China's rise potentially affects the logic of each side. Now, one thing I'll just highlight at the beginning, it's frustrating. I'm going to say there's two basic schools. China's rise makes both of their arguments stronger. So it doesn't resolve the debate, but it complicates the debate, or it changes the debate. So grand strategy, just for those of you that are not familiar with the term, is really a term for sort of what regions of the globe should the United States be committed to protecting. Lots of sub-questions about how should it do it, and so on and so forth. I'm mostly going to just focus on the top line. And for us today, it means, should we stay in Northeast Asia? During the Cold War, there was an extensive, or after the Cold War, I should say, after the Soviet Union fell apart, there was an extensive debate about whether the United States should change its grand strategy. But it never got to be a close call. Somewhat interestingly, we continued to be basically as committed around the globe throughout the post-Cold War era as we were during it, even though the Cold War was, that grand strategy was designed to deal with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union went away, and we still stayed in Europe and Asia, and then we went a lot of other places in addition, partly because we had the leeway, and we found various purposes, but that's a whole other thing. But China's rise did not play much of a role in that debate, and it hasn't played much role yet. I'm going to say there's, like I said, two schools. For those of you that follow this, you'll know many more schools. One of them we're going to call engagement. Should we maintain our allies in Europe and Asia and stay committed in the Gulf? I'm just going to focus on Asia. There are many sub-schools. So those of you that might be thinking offshore balancing, you might be thinking American dominance. Those are all sort of in various ways in the engagement school. And then there's the neo-isolationists, which basically say we should end our alliances. It's neo in the sense that we would still be engaged economically, so it's not full isolation. And I'm going to summarize those two schools and then play out for you how China's rise influences the relative strength. Now, it's not very satisfying, like I said, because they're both stronger, but it's interesting. And some of the changes that are created by China's rise give insights into which school you might line up with. So the basics of engagement, I should say, as I've already, or just make be clear, engagement is our current policy. It's been our policy in one form or another since the late 1940s. And the United States protects its interests around the globe via deterrence, and it does this with allies. So I don't have time to go into it, but for instance, we didn't want a state to dominate Eurasia, so we formed alliances in Europe and in Asia. They were in our, we did it for our interest, not for their interest. Today we have important alliances with Japan and South Korea. It's not quite an alliance with Taiwan, but we have a very important commitment, conditional commitment to Taiwan. We have, people are concerned about the freedom of the seas, which are both a peacetime and wartime concern, which is basically the ability of trade to transit the open oceans. And the United States has a concern for what's more broadly called the regional order, sort of slowly the economic openness, the nature of the broad international economic system, and also maybe a variety of norms that the United States helped develop about territorial rights and appropriate behavior. So these are our interests, and the argument is we need our alliances, and we need to be forward deployed militarily in one form or another to protect them. A second argument for engagement is that it helps stop proliferation. So there's a concern that if we were not there protecting our allies, all of whom of our key allies can get nuclear weapons, they would get nuclear weapons, which we don't want them to do. So instead of having Japan and South Korea and Germany as nuclear powers, we stay in Europe and Asia and convince them they don't need nuclear weapons. Sometimes we've had to lean on them. Sometimes they've leaned back on us. But in any event, most people think that if we weren't there, it would influence the likelihood of proliferation. And so if you're worried about proliferation, as this school is and thinks it's undesirable, then you should stay. And this school also argues that U.S. alliances and our forward deployment help keep the international economic system open. And so the U.S. prosperity, which grew out of in the Cold War era, was partly enabled by alliances, and the concern is that not having those alliances make it more likely that the system would become more closed, more competitive, we'd have trade wars, and the prosperity benefits, as well as possibly the peace-creating benefits of trade would be lost. So, with all due respect to oversimplification, those are, I would say, are like the key arguments. And then the question is, what happens to those with China's rise? Well, if China strives for regional hegemony, or even just if it doesn't but has overwhelming power, it will increase threats to U.S. interests. So these increased threats, oops, I want to go back. these increased threats mean that our allies are more valuable, right? Because our interests are more threatened, our allies protect those interests, so China's rise means it's more important to be forward deployed. Excuse me just for a second. Our allies will be more vulnerable, and so deterrence is more valuable, which is another way of sort of saying the first bullet point. But quickly following from that, the growing threat would increase Japan's and Taiwan's incentives and South Korea's incentives, I should have put in there, to acquire nuclear weapons. So because those countries will be more vulnerable, particularly Japan, Taiwan's been vulnerable. I think South Korea already has its reasons to get nuclear weapons. The key country here is Japan. Because Japan is more vulnerable, it has greater incentives. So we need to we need to build their confidence. We need to make sure that there are not questions about our credibility. And engagement is the way to do that. So the value of reassurance increases. And continuing with the basic argument here is that security guarantees preserve economic openness by making China's ability to use threats against those countries less effective. So in other words, one concern is that China will use its economic but also military weight to coerce countries and undermine some of the trading system. So in addition just to the basic argument that alliances support open economics, there's a specific argument here. Okay. It wouldn't be interesting if there weren't at least one good flip side. And so the neo-isolationists have the clearest counter set of arguments. Their argument is quite bold, but actually surprisingly strong, which is we just don't have security interests in Europe and Asia. Our interests are in preserving and protecting the United States from attack. What happens in Europe and Asia doesn't matter. We can protect ourselves anyway. We can talk about that. Turns out it's actually just on its own narrow terms, I think quite a compelling argument. A regional war won't threaten U.S. vital interests. The U.S. homeland won't be attacked. The U.S. economy won't be damaged, but not severely damaged. And so better just to stay out of this mess, preserve our resources, and not be involved, not all over the globe. We're not talking about like the Iraqs and Afghanistans, but we're talking about Europe and Asia. Moreover, alliance commitments, according to this school, are dangerous. If there's a war in Europe and you're deployed in Europe, you're there to deter that war, but if you're there, you're in the war. Same thing, if there's a war between China and one of our allies, the whole way we make our deterrent threat credible is by we have forces in that country, we've got reputation on the line, you're guaranteeing you're in that war. So if you're not sure you can prevent it, the best way to stay out of the war is just to be out of there, not be there. On proliferation, many people see benefits. It's a bit counterintuitive, although some academics have staked their careers on this. But in some ways, your ally with nuclear weapons is much better able to deter an attack on its homeland than you are able to deter an attack on its homeland, because it's its homeland. So it's more willing to run the risk of escalation. The great concern about U.S. protecting allies, from the perspective of our allies, is that we won't come to their aid. It's very risky when you face a nuclear power. So proliferation might actually be good in the right hands and in the right places with an advanced, stable country, and Japan would certainly fit that bill. And then finally, the argument is economic openness doesn't require U.S. security guarantees. It's basically the economic value of the market is what drives openness. Trade is good for all players, and U.S. security guarantees are not essential. So these are old arguments, right? These are the established arguments. What does China's rise do to these? China's rise, most people think, makes war more likely. It's more militarily capable. It's a determined state. It has interest. It's not satisfied with the status quo, at least with respect to Taiwan. If war is more likely, our alliances are more dangerous because they guarantee we'll be in those wars. Proliferation becomes more valuable and appropriate if, in fact, China poses a really large threat to our allies that we maybe can't protect them. Right? China is becoming increasingly militarily capable. Japan is having doubts about its long-term ability to protect itself, not so much from invasion, but from various types of economic coercion and maybe coercion in a conventional war. Proliferation then will be valuable. It will make Japan more secure, and it may be a necessary deterrent. In addition, U.S. commitments strain U.S.-China relations. We're in their region. We're close. We threaten their sea lanes. We protect Taiwan. And the strain in U.S.-China relations is arguably bad for the United States. Our interests are in the United States, not in the region. Strained relations are bad. But even putting that aside, I mean, bad for peace. But in addition, insecurity fuels protectionist policies, right? So strained U.S.-China policies are going to hurt the open economic system. More likely that the system will stay open if the United States is out of the region, U.S.-China relations aren't strained, and we don't worry about the relative gains and technological implications of trade. So this argument would say somewhat counterintuitively, but I think powerfully, if you want to keep the economic system open, I think we need to rebalance a lot of things, but I don't think most people think that we want to have an ongoing trade competition with China. Maybe we should just get out of the region. Now, that's all I'm going to say about this. I'm not going to resolve these two questions, these two sides. I leave it to you to think about, or we can talk about in question and answer. Deeply embedded in here are a variety of theory questions, both about the dangers of proliferation, about the nature of China, the nature of the system. But this is a huge choice for the United States. And given the sea change that's taking place with China's rise, and if you think, once again, dealing with these uncertainties, that China is going to continue to become more capable, maintain politically effective at home, then this is a very important decision. Okay. Us leaving is having said all that, it's very unlikely we're going to leave. I mean, the case is strong. I think the case is strong on both sides. For a variety of reasons, we're likely to stay. But staying in Asia does not mean that we keep our commitment to Taiwan. We can stay and protect our key interests, which are arguably Japan and South Korea, Australia, but Australia is way on the outer edge of the China threat, but not continue to keep Taiwan. So you could say we can have essentially our same grand strategy. Taiwan was never at the core of it. It was always Japan and South Korea. Question is, should we do it? So just some basics on this. We have a commitment now to protect Taiwan if China launches an unprovoked attack. And by unprovoked, what we mean is a situation in which Taiwan does not move officially toward independence or become independent. So right now, Taiwan is an independent country day to day, but it still maintains that it's, or accepts that it's part of China. And there's a kind of complicated fiction around it. But if Taiwan changes that, its status, then China may well anyway, so that's what, on the other hand, there's a kind of dual deterrence, which is we don't want Taiwan to declare dependence. And so we say we'll protect you only if the attack is unprovoked. If you provoke it, we're not coming to your aid. And so in that sense, we're deterring Taiwan because they'll be on their own if they provoke the attack, or if they take this action and China follows through. A few basics on Taiwan. Importantly, it's a democracy. It was not always a democracy. It was not a democracy when we were actually an ally, but it is now a multi-party democracy. It's an advanced industrial economy, produces some of the world's highest quality semiconductors, and has a relatively large population, 23 million or 24 million. China, as I've said a couple times, believes Taiwan is part of China. We don't think of it that way, but it is how China thinks about it, and we just need to accept it. Okay, my screen just died. So I don't know what to do about that.
The local screen here.
Well, I think I'll just sort of click through and see what happens. Slideshow. Okay, there we go. And unification has been a long-standing goal. So it's not only that this is not something China is comfortable about, but it's unification is a very important policy for China. All right, I can't see anything here, but this makes it a little hard. Sorry. Okay. Well, we're just gonna have to. I can't even see my pointer. Oh, okay. Okay. I can't explain this. Okay. Well, anyway, so in addition, there's not only a danger of provocation. It's possible that China at some point will decide to act on its own and say, we've waited long enough. We're going to actually bring Taiwan under our control. So the possibility of war here is two-sided. One is that Taiwan provokes the war, but also that China just decides it's not going to wait any longer. The current president has said this is not a problem we should pass on to the next generation. Count that in how many ever decades you want, but it's not unlimited. And the argument is that we don't have, China would say from its perspective, does not have unlimited patience to deal with this question. I think it's by far the most likely scenario for a large war between China and the United States is over Taiwan. Most people have looked at the South China Sea where there's been a lot of pushing and shoving, and you can make up scenarios, but keep in mind the South China Sea is about a bunch of little islands, barely islands, that you can barely find on a map. Actually, you can't find them on a map. Like on Google Maps, you have to like keep pressing to go in and in and in, and before, just about when it pixelates, you can find the biggest of these little islands. There are a whole variety of other issues, but it's just, you can tell stories, but the stakes just don't warrant a large war. The stakes over Taiwan arguably warrant a large war. It's a major democracy. It's the 15th or 16th largest GNP in the world. It's populated, unlike these little islands, mostly don't have anybody on them. And there are a variety of ways that that conflict could happen. And so it's not to say we should break it, but I think that commitment, but we have to recognize, I think, that it's a risky commitment. Because this is a paramount issue for China. We don't get to completely control either whether China attacks or whether Taiwan moves toward independence, which it often is moving in that direction. And so I think it's dangerous. I think it's by far the most dangerous issue on the table. And in fact, if you think about it, the reason I got fascinated with the question was from a really macro, realist type view. If you look at it, you can't figure out why China and the United States would even have strained relations. Like, you always have to say, what's it about? Taiwan is an easy answer to that. Okay, so what are the benefits? And I'm going to leave less time for questions than I wanted, so I'm going to go even faster. But what are the benefit of ending the commitment? It eliminates that path to war, which I think is by far if it's the most likely path, and you're talking about a major power, there's a major nuclear weapon state, and you can eliminate the most likely path to war, that's a powerful argument. Whoops. Of course, I can't even control the PowerPoint, so. It's not a new danger. This danger has been there a long time, right? China, we've had this disagreement with China ever since basically Taiwan became independent following the Civil War. But things are changing. China is much more capable. It was not capable of conquering Taiwan until recently. Maybe now it is blockading it. It's a real military capability we didn't see before. And as I mentioned, the Chinese leadership has indicated that it's may not wait forever. So the danger is changing. It's not new, but it's, I think, significantly larger. Another key advantage is that it could increase Chinese security, partly because they're insecure as long as they don't control Taiwan, but also because it makes the United States look less threatening. You could say, like, why would the United States be a threat? Well, we're actually controlling a piece of land that they consider a part of their country. It'd be sort of like if China controlled California. And we say, well, California is part of the United States. They say, that's fine, we've got it. So we control Taiwan in a sense, and they see that us as undermining a key thing they want. It's too easy from our perspective to, I think, underappreciate how strongly the Chinese feel about this. but it makes us look like we're opposed to their success as a major power. And then a point that's often lost is that in a lot of ways, much of the competition, the military competition between the United States and China really is driven, I believe, by Taiwan, because there's very little else to worry about. But it turns out the Chinese conventional buildup is primarily about Taiwan. A lot of its additional conventional buildup is about controlling the South China Sea, which is the key access to Taiwan. If the Taiwan issue goes away, there's a lot less to compete about. So you could arguably unwind the military competition, which is straining the relationship, which is straining the political, the economic relationship, and also could drag the countries into conflict over other issues. Okay, so what are the costs? If it was as easy as that, we'd be done. Okay, so what are the direct costs? First, and this is the one I think is most important, is even though we don't have core national security interests, and I would say, and we only have limited economic interest in Taiwan, we do have important sort of political and ideological interests. They've been a partner. It's a thriving democracy. The United States has tried to spread freedom and supported the spread of freedom around the world. We've sometimes done it through the use of force, which is probably a bad idea. This didn't happen through force, and you consider it to be an accomplishment. Of course, the Taiwanese deserve much of the credit, but the United States has helped in an important way. And so it's a part of what many people think should be part of U.S. foreign policy. Another danger, and this is a theory debate, is if we break the commitment to Taiwan, it will encourage the Chinese to ask for more, to go make further demands. You don't want to make concessions to an expansionist state. You don't want to make concessions to a state that has unlimited aims. The whole Munich analogy is about the mistake of giving up some to Hitler when he wanted to conquer all of Europe, if not the globe. But if Hitler had only wanted a little territory, some of those concessions might have been a good idea. It would just, game's over, everything is done. It's possible that if China would be satisfied with Taiwan and it had limited aims, that would be a very good move. But if China wants to control all of Northeast Asia, maybe not control it like occupy it, but control it and dominate it, and we don't want them to. Or if they eventually, like the National Defense Strategy says, they want to compete globally, then we don't want to encourage them by making concessions and suggesting we lack resolve, and that Taiwan is just the first step to concession after concession, and eventually we will give them California. Okay, so those are the first two. It risks weakening U.S. military capabilities. So it turns out, and this is actually a major uncertainty, but if you look at the map, Taiwan actually does create a couple relatively narrow passageways, still not narrow, but relatively narrow passageways that China can get from the East China Sea and the South China Sea into the Pacific Ocean. And right now, because we control Taiwan, it gives us the ability to monitor a variety of traffic, but most importantly, submarine traffic through those gaps. Turns out that if China can easily get submarines out into the Pacific or beyond what's called the first island chain, it can keep U.S. carrier battle groups further away, and it would start to weaken the U.S. ability to meet some of its key missions in the region. So it's potentially militarily dangerous for us to not control Taiwan. Now, once again, to actually analyze this, you'd have to look at the full suite of growing Chinese capabilities, not only the additional capability they might have from having Taiwan. I think the value is exaggerated, but I would also point out, looking at both sides of this, if we're not going to get into a conflict with China anyway, it doesn't matter if they have somewhat improved military capabilities. So once again, the uncertainties are very, very hard to manage here. And then finally, a point that I mentioned earlier, there's a danger that if we ended our commitment to Taiwan, that it would destroy the U.S.-Japan alliance or other alliances, because Japan might decide that it couldn't rely on the United States and maybe it should just sort of side with China. I'll just say, on this one, I think it's incredibly unlikely. The animosity between China and Japan suggests that that's not happening anytime soon. It's way more likely, which still might be bad, that China would get nuclear weapons than it would that it would sort of side with China. And so then we're back in that grand strategy debate about how bad is the proliferation. But anyway, I'm going to stop there. I went a little bit longer, but I tried to cover a lot. I not so much wanted to give you my bottom line on any of these issues, some of which I have bottom lines on and some of which I don't, but just to sort of see, with more time, how you might systematically go through, both to break up the big question into manageable pieces, to emphasize to some extent the importance of asking the right questions because they determine what you really look at. And sometimes, particularly in these situations, we shouldn't take the status quo for granted. And then the role of theory and uncertainty in grappling with these issues. So thank you, and I think we have time for like 20 minutes or 25 minutes. Okay, good.
I'll just help you calling questions. If you
Okay,
have a
great.
question, raise your hand. Yes. Sorry, is the mic coming to you? Right here to your right.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It's incredibly wonderful to have you here. I have two quite different questions, so take your pick. One is
I'll take the easy one.
how did the recent events in Hong Kong affect our evaluation of the direct costs of conceding Taiwan in terms of the democracy and freedom on the island? And the second is, how does the colonial history of the West and Japan in China affect how we evaluate China's security aims, in that all of the lands that China is claiming in terms of Taiwan and the South China Sea islands are all lands that it held before Western or Japanese colonial interests caused the century of humiliation and so
great.
forth.
I'll take the first one. So Hong Kong and Taiwan, I think that it's a great question. I think that Chinese, well, it's interesting today, the House of Representatives voted to support democracy in Hong Kong, which sounds really obvious to you. It's like, of course there should be democracy there, but it occurred to me once again, using my California analogy, because unlike Taiwan, Hong Kong is part of China. Hong Kong is part of China when there's an understanding established by the British and the Chinese about how Hong Kong will be ruled for 50 years after the turnover, but it is part of China. So it's sort of interesting, like what does China think when the U.S. House of Representatives calls for democracy in Hong Kong? I'm not saying it's wrong, but it must, among other things, it would look extremely hostile to the Chinese government. So if that hadn't occurred to you when you read the paper, it's just like, look at this from China's perspective. The more important point, though, the more relevant point here, is that Hong Kong, there was a hope that China would allow and respect, well, first of all, it would respect the deal, and the deal was that that Hong Kong would be, for the most part, a self-ruling democracy. And in a variety of ways, China has not let that happen, including by limiting who could run and be represented in the legislature. Now, in a variety of ways, China is intervening more in Hong Kong. And although I will say the demonstrators are asking for a lot, but China is showing its willingness in a variety of ways, both in cyber and information, as well as limited use of force to repress in Hong Kong. If you look at that and say that Hong Kong was supposed to be the example that would convince Taiwan that it would willingly unify with the mainland, it's obviously working in exactly the opposite direction. What it suggests is that China, because Hong Kong is small, much smaller than Taiwan, but it's still 6 million people, 23, both large and important economies. The situation is doing damage to the economy in Hong Kong, that China would be willing to do the same thing over time in Taiwan. And so it makes it hard to be optimistic that we could break the commitment with Taiwan and that over time, that there would be one China, two systems in Taiwan that allowed Taiwan to be the type of democracy that it currently is. From my perspective, since I said one of the largest costs is the first cost, is the concession of protecting a system that we value, I think that it means we should expect that the costs are larger. In other words, if they're behaving, let's say, poorly in Hong Kong, it means that we're going to have the same kind of costs in Taiwan, and I think that just makes it a harder decision. or we should recognize that it's a more costly decision. And so that cuts against that, would cut against breaking our commitment to Taiwan. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but I mean, I think we have to face up to that's the likely outcome. I will say, on the flip side, and it's not at all why I was in favor of breaking the commitment to Taiwan, I think that if we broke the commitment to Taiwan, it would be a huge headache for China. Because it would be like Hong Kong on steroids, right? I mean, because it's a vibrant democracy, it's had its own system, it's a large economy, it's gonna be very hard for China to productively integrate Taiwan into the Chinese system. So it's not a good reason to do it, but then they can't say it's, they can't blame it on us, they can't blame it on anybody. It's just Taiwan, and increasingly Taiwanese do not want to be part of the mainland.
Got a couple questions in the back row until you get a microphone.
Hi, thank you for being with us today. I just had a quick question about, you identified these two schools, the engagement and the neo-isolationist, and I'm
Yeah.
just curious about how you fit our current approach into that model, because I think the way I see the Trump administration's approach is, well, if neo-isolationist is everything but the economic engagement, it seems like the Trump approach is only targeting the economic engagement as sort of a blunt tool for everything else and not addressing the regional commitments. So I'm curious about how you kind of square current events with the theoretical model.
Or at least with the description. I think that, I mean, we're still very much involved. I mean, we have engagement in the basic sense, right? The key thing about engagement is we have allies that we are committed to protecting. Trump has said a variety of things that understandably we are allies and should, and things he shouldn't have said. But U.S. policy continues to, by and large, be the policy that, even with all the ups and downs that it has been, which is we're still, I mean, Trump was reluctant to say he would accept our Article 5 commitment to NATO, but eventually he did. We've continued to operate and plan with and support NATO. We're continuing to pivot toward Asia and be prepared to protect our allies in East Asia. So the core of that engagement strategy is there. We've kept our central our key allies in Western Europe, or now Western and Central Europe, and in East Asia, and in complicated ways also in the Gulf. On the open economic system, I mean, the United States, once again, is not, I mean, there's some people who want to disengage from China, which I think is unlikely. But right now, we're deeply, engaged economically throughout the world, and still with China, with the goal of rebalancing the economic playing field with China. But at least official policy and most observers don't want to break that commitment either. So I mean, I think a kind of corrected, which needed to happen, a kind of corrected trade arrangement with China is still the likely outcome.
Hi, thank you for speaking today. I'm just wondering, with China, if China's economy continues to grow, how likely do you think that if it uses its economic leverage, how likely would it be that other countries who otherwise wouldn't have bandwagoned with China start, leaning away from the U.S. and more towards China? Because you see U.S. allies such as South Korea and Japan, and a large share of their export market is with China. So if they're assured that China will continue to be like one of their largest trading partners, will they bounce away from the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, most U.S. allies want to have it both ways in the good sense, which is they want the United States as their security guarantor and China as their trading partner. The United States is the same, by the way. we want to defend against China and also trade with China. But people are worried about the amount of economic influence that China, and also, I guess, the political overflow from that amount of economic influence. And so I think this is going to be one. We haven't seen this before in the modern era, where we face an economically extremely capable adversary. The Soviet Union was an economic basket case, and so we didn't, we didn't have to confront these issues. I think my sense is that for the foreseeable future, that China, because it's pursuing threatening policies, is going to assure that our allies want to stay allied with us. and that when push comes to shove, if they have to, they'll actually reduce their economic engagement with China, only if they have to, but that's the same with us, I think, only if we need to. If China starts to look less threatening in various ways, and I think it's greatly misplayed its hand in the South China Sea and has created an image which is potentially much more hostile than its goals are. And if the United States becomes an unreliable alliance, or it looks to be an increasingly unreliable alliance partner, that's when we'll start to lose, not in security terms, but where you'll start to see countries becoming neutral politically and trading with China. I think that one is in our control if we manage it correctly.
Raise your hand if you have a question. I see one right here, the Williams purple. I hate to see you wearing that. We'll be getting you a new T-shirt. Listen, while you're waiting for the mic, I have a question for you. You studied physics as an undergraduate. At MIT, am I remembering that? I mean, that impresses me.
That's good. I'm glad, yeah.
I mean, it's not Caltech, but it's impressive.
Most political scientists have at least econ envy, so at least that's not severe physics
And
envy.
you got a master's in physics. So what I would like to know is what's more difficult, physics or politics?
Okay, well, you know what Einstein said? Because he said politics is way harder. But I'm not an Einstein. I thought physics was way harder.
So like everyone else said, thank you so much for coming today. This was a really just like excellent way to learn about a lot of the issues facing China. My question is sort of related to the point about allied confidence, but so you mentioned a lot about how Japan is sort of intrinsically going to sort of avoid cooperating with China, but my question is more about to what extent does our commitment to Taiwan both sort of show U.S. resolve or change allied behavior in ways that could potentially affect North Korean behavior, which is obviously a less pressing military threat in terms of capabilities than China, but might have sort of different resolve or intentions with using force and could sort of withdrawing from Taiwan either change South Korean or Japanese behavior in ways that threaten them or make the U.S. seem more likely, or less likely rather, to use force to deter them?
This is one of the key arguments against sort of breaking or even raising doubts about the commitment to Taiwan, which is that South Korea and Japan will doubt our commitment. I think that particularly if it's well handled, that we can explain that Japan is different than Taiwan, and that the reasons that we're ending our commitment to Taiwan don't apply to Japan. And Japan won't completely believe it. I mean, they'll still be nervous about it, but they'll understand the difference. And so the logic of sort of connectedness of credibility depends upon the similarity of the things that are connected. And if they're identical and you break a commitment to one, it makes sense you're going to break a commitment to another. Depends upon what dimensions you're measuring similarity. They're both in East Asia, right? So they're similar. But they're very different. And so I think we could explain that. But we can also demonstrate it. I mean, so if you say we're not protecting Taiwan, but we're building up forces in Japan, we're increasing interoperability. We're trying to strengthen and deepen that alliance at the same time that you're breaking a different commitment. I think we can maintain the credibility of the alliance. Now, I think there'd be panic in Japan. But I think over time it would resolve itself in the way that I'm suggesting. I also think that Japan doesn't have good alternatives. So it's not like you take advantage of your allies when they don't have good alternatives, but when you sort of say, what's the likely cost, we do care about how Japan would actually act. And I think that they would keep the alliance. If anything, they would work with us to deepen the alliance. So I don't see that as I will say, once again, uncertainties. A lot of people who are expert in the region disagree with me on this, and certainly the Japanese will say that they would be very upset about it. Interestingly, I think it's in Japan's interest for us to break our commitment with Taiwan. The way that you get a war between China and Japan is over Taiwan. I don't think China wants to attack Japan. But if there's a war with Taiwan, two things are going to happen. Japan's going to get attacked because we have bases there. And so to blunt the US capability, China will have to attack Japan. Two, increasingly over the last 15 years, the relationship between the United States and Japan has deepened in such a way that Japan is responsible for aiding the United States when it's fighting in the region, which means in a Taiwan scenario. So if this war happens between where the United States comes to the aid of Taiwan, Japan's in the war. And it's by far the most likely way that I think that Japan's going to get in a war with China is over Taiwan. So, I mean, somewhat ironically, even though there might be military costs to not having that alliance, I think it would actually be in Japan's interest. Now, Japan's not making that case, so that might make you doubt my argument, but with good reason. But in any event, I think when you just on its face, it's actually quite a danger for Japan.
We have time for a couple more questions, then we're going to have to let people, let these students go get some food. They're getting hungry. Back row. If you have a question, signaling interest to me.
Yeah. About your point that ending the United States commitment to Taiwan will reduce the competition between China and Taiwan, how would you refute the counterargument that Taiwan is never the cause of the conflicts between the United States and China? It's always about China becoming the second strongest power, and the gap between China and the United States is getting smaller. And Taiwan is probably just a card that the United States can use during conflicts, just like this year during the trade war. There were like the United States Marine forces near Taiwan Sea, and ending this commitment won't reduce the competition at all.
Okay, so this is another concern. I mean, the question, as I understood it, was that we'll make a concession over Taiwan, but it actually won't moderate the competition. And so this comes back to the point that I mentioned at the beginning, which is what do we really believe? What type of China do we face? I mean, one view is that China doesn't have extensive ambitions, and it really wants to control Taiwan and maybe have greater control over the South China Sea, which is a mystery. Or the other view is no, that it actually, we're going to compete on all fronts. They're going to compete to push us out of Asia. They might even want to compete with us in the Persian Gulf in a couple of decades. They're building the capabilities that would aim. So if we're facing that second type of China that wants to compete all the way to the Gulf, put aside to Europe, then making concessions on Taiwan will not help. And in fact, it will hurt. Because it will both somewhat increase their capabilities and it will embolden them, and it will raise doubts about U.S. resolve. That's a possibility. And so that's why it's one of the key uncertainties. And the any decision about Taiwan has to be made with that possibility in mind. Now, there are certain ways that we can, it might still be in our interest, even if the competition becomes more intense. Because you'll still have eliminated what I think is the most likely path to war. But then you'd still compete. You'd compete to deter attacks against Japan. You'd compete to be able to, over time, control the sea lanes in the Indian Ocean. And so it's possible that it could still be in U.S. security interests, even if the competition continues, but it's less in our interest than if it actually moderated the competition. And so once again, it's just a different aspect of the trade-off in that choice. I increasingly think that I would be willing to make the trade even if it didn't reduce the overall competition. But I think it's a very hard judgment.
Any last questions? I see right here. Yeah. And there's one right behind you, too.
Is the wild card of Russia significant in this discussion? Given the shared border, obviously Russia is a wild card, economic issues, et cetera. How do you figure that into it, and what's the probability of that coming into play in the discussion?
Yeah. So questions about Russia and how it fits in. I mean, right, people have worried over the last couple of decades about the possibility of there is a loose alliance or pseudo-alliance between Russia and China. They actually have engaged in some limited joint military exercises. I think that in the end that Russia's not going to matter very much in the area, in the region. Chances are that for a variety of reasons that the Russia-China relationship will pull apart before long. But even if it doesn't, Russia is a declining power. And I mean, it has one important asset, and it's not to be underestimated, which is it still has a very large nuclear force. And we'd have to factor that into the conversation. But Russia doesn't have the conventional assets to significantly help the Chinese in any relevant conflict. and they're not going to be an important economic player, except in the oil market, which frankly they've got about 3 decades, and the oil market's going to be pretty much gone anyway. So I think they're not. I mean, it's an important to think about, and I think it makes sense to worry a little bit about Russia-China alliance, but I don't think they're not going to be a major player in East Asia.
Charlie,
And that's
let's
once
shoot
again, that's
one
my
more
view. I could be
question
wrong, but that's my guess, my hunch.
in the background.
I have a question about resolving like the theoretical debate of China's like intentions. So I guess my question is, what factors or issues do you look to in like resolving that debate, and do you have any scholars that you like particularly follow when trying to determine like is China a revisionist power? Do they have intentions beyond regional hegemony?
You know, in some ways, no, I think that, well, I gave you, the reason I started at the beginning with you've got experts on both sides that don't agree on this one. By my own personal preference, or people that I know best, they tend to be more on the moderate side and think that China does not aspire to global hegemony, but they could be wrong. It's partly a theory debate, right? Because there is this question about whether to succeed as a major power, China has to dominate its region. Whether to be secure as a major, I don't think so. So some theorists do, some theorists don't. I think that, I think that's something just on logical grounds I can show is wrong. But there may be many non-realist, non-security reasons that China is more ambitious than just wanting to be narrowly secure in its region. And if it is, then it's a very complicated, then they can be very ambitious. So to the extent that they are, we have to hedge against that. And I think it's one thing I've tried to show, but I haven't gone into in detail. It's not an all or nothing choice. Like you can have some dimensions of cooperation while at the same time being, you don't necessarily say competitive, by being intensely defensive. So you can make sure that you can invest a huge amount in protecting your allies. And if you can do that without making the adversary insecure, you can also make concessions in various ways. And so I think the most tricky question from a theory perspective is, I would call China like a mixed state. It's a state that's certainly driven by security and likely is driven somewhat by status and maybe more than that to go beyond security. And the question is, how do you deal with a mixed type? And it turns out analytically, in policy terms, it's the most complicated circle to square. And you often can't do it. In the sense perfectly, and you have to make trade-offs. So you be in a situation where to adequately defend your allies, you have to threaten China, which turns out to be partly self-defeating because China is a security-seeking state. But I actually think that is analytically the situation that we're in, where we don't know what type they are, and we need a robust policy that's going to involve trade-offs that are none of which is entirely satisfactory because we face that uncertainty.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.